I dyed this Superwash Merino yarn at home with a Crockpot in stages over several days. It's my easy, fuss-free method of dyeing wool yarn. Here's a quick run-through of how, step by step. First off, prep your yarn for dyeing. I usually dye 2 skeins at a time and loosely tie them together. Even if you are just dyeing 1 skein, it is recommended that you tie it off in at least 2 additional places to keep the yarn from tangling. I also label my yarn by type, size, and length with fade-resistant jewelry repair cleaning tags. As I also make jewelry, these were a no-brainer to use. Another thing I have on hand is a skein of yarn ready to absorb any extra dye from the dye pot, should there be any. I don't like to waste any product, and I've created new color combos this way. I save money and maximize my dyeing experience. Superwash Merino is a wonderful choice for yarn dyeing since it doesn't felt. My equipment of choice for this project is a Crockpot, dedicated for dyeing only, of course. I've already added hot water to the Crockpot, and I'll go ahead and add the dye next. After mixing in half a tablespoon of powdered dye, I dipped a section of the yarn into the Crockpot. I'm using Country Classics in the color gold, which does not need the addition of citric acid or vinegar. I also didn't pre-soak this yarn, as I will probably have to dye it in stages over the next couple of days. The gold section is done, and now I've added approximately 2 tablespoons of citric acid and a 1/4 teaspoon jacquard teal to the Crockpot and dipped in another section. As you can see, the water is clear, which means the dye has fully exhausted and the color has completely transferred to the yarn. Grabbing some rubber gloves to protect my hands, I cautiously remove the yarn from the Crockpot and gently squeeze out the water. Teal is one of my favorite colors. Remember, this is 2 skeins of yarn tied together, so I will have 2 practically identical dyed skeins when this is done. Here's a closer look at the 2 sections dyed. All right, let's do this final section. I've already added approximately 2 tablespoons of citric acid and a 1/4 teaspoon of G&S dye in the color burgundy to a bit of warm water in the Crockpot. After adding the boiled water, I stir the mixture to dissolve the powdered dye and citric acid. I make sure to be careful not to splash hot dye water on me and to not breathe in the powdered dye while stirring. Protecting your skin and clothes with gloves, goggles, a mask, and an apron whenever possible is always a good idea. I make sure to be really careful if I'm not donning the full protective gear. Now to dip the final section into the Crockpot. I hang the 2 other sections already dyed to the side and move my rectangular Crockpot closer to catch any drips. After a few minutes, I check on how the color is developing. Using a spoon, I'll gently press the yarn into the dye and shift it around in the pot to distribute the color more evenly. You've probably heard that you need to pre-mix your dye into a liquid concentrate and pre-soak your yarn in a soap like Synthropol to open up the fibers and get it prepped for dyeing. Although this is advisable, I prefer to take a lot of shortcuts when dyeing yarn. It's partially due to saving time, but mostly because it's part of my creative process to let things roll and see what happens. I take detailed notes as I go just in case I want to replicate the outcome. Also, I find that once the dyed yarn is dry, if I don't like the color, then there is an opportunity to over-dye to intensify the color or change the hue. You can come up with some unique colors this way, but more about that later. I mainly dye fibers for spinning, but once in a while I like to dye commercial yarn. When I get on a dyeing or spinning tangent, I end up with a backlog of yarn. So I list those for sale on my website. Let's remove this section now and see how it looks. Once again, I gently squeeze out the water with my rubber gloves. You don't have to remove all the hot water, just enough that it doesn't drip and scald you while getting it over to the sink for the final rinse. Time to fill the sink and rinse the newly dyed yarn. This small bar sink came equipped in this space that I now call my studio. It's a working sink that has seen a lot of art over the years, hence all the splattered paint. Don't worry, it won't come off on the yarn. I'll let this sit for a few minutes, then come back and check if any of the dye has been released from the fiber. I'll add Synthropol in a second rinse if the water is not clear after this soak. Synthropol is a type of soap used for prepping fibers for dyeing or removing dye particles afterward. If you don't have Synthropol, you can use Blue Dawn dish soap. The water appears to remain clear, so I think it's safe to get this drained and hung outside to dry. Freshly dyed yarn will be the most vibrant, and the color will mute once dry. This color looks great and the dye has exhausted fully, but I can't be so sure I'll be happy with the results until I see the skeins completely dry. After draining the water, I give it a gentle squeeze, careful not to over-agitate. Superwash Merino does not felt, but I don't want it to get tangled. A salad spinner has been an incredibly useful tool in the studio. Who knew? Think of it as a mini washing machine spinning out the excess water. I tend to pump my yarn and fiber through the salad spinner at least 3 times. Usually by the 3rd time there is significantly less water and then it can be hung up to dry. I bought this spinner 40% off after Christmas online several years ago. It's well used and has a huge crack in the lid to prove it. Now that a significant amount of water has been removed, we'll hang this up to dry. So I have a confession. These are not the original colors. Once dry, I found the color to be a bit too dull for my liking, so I overdyed each area. Unfortunately, I didn't capture the process on camera, but the original gold section got overdyed with 1 tablespoon of grasshopper, the teal section with a 1/4 teaspoon more teal, and the burgundy overdyed with 1 teaspoon of magenta. Now this worsted weight yarn is vibrant and saturated with color, and most importantly, I'm happy with it. And here I am with the finished product. You may notice, especially in the teal section, that the color is of an uneven saturation. I intentionally dye my yarn this way because I like how it knits up with the darker and lighter variations within the same color. I think it looks more interesting than the usual even saturation you see with commercial yarn. If you wanted a more solid color, you would need to soak your yarn beforehand, preferably with a product like Synthropol to open up the fibers, and then add salt to the dye bath. This will even out the distribution of the color in your yarn and not give so much of a mottled, uneven effect. You may also have to use more dye. I hope this inspires you to experiment with dyeing wool yarn with a Crockpot. Remember, you don't have to get it right the first time. Tweaks can always be made. I'd love to hear from you if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos. More info about me, my creative process, and the products I have for sale can be found at leilanihandmade.com.